Hey guys, so welcome to Bio 20. Today we're going to be going over the first lesson. This unit is kind of the most basic unit. We're going to be going over different things about the biosphere, populations, ecosystems, that sort of thing. So let's get into it. Okay, so today's lesson is all about the biosphere. We're going to be going over what a biosphere is, also going to be defining things like ecosystem, community, population, and organism, as well as how those different terms are related. Then we're going to go over the difference between biotic and abiotic factors. We're going to define genetic diversity and biodiversity. And then lastly, we're going to talk about what dynamic equilibrium is and how biodiversity in particular helps support dynamic equilibrium. So the biosphere is the narrow zone around the Earth that supports life. So kind of anywhere on Earth or in Earth's atmosphere where living things are found. There are three different zones of the biosphere. There is the lithosphere, which is all of the land on Earth that supports life, the hydrosphere, which is the water here on Earth, and then the atmosphere is all of the air that is surrounding Earth that supports life. Biotic and abiotic components, or abiotic and biotic factors, are ways that we can describe different parts of the biosphere. The biotic components are any of the living parts of the biosphere, so the plants, animals, bacteria, all that kind of stuff. And then the abiotic components are the non-living parts of the biosphere. So those are all of the chemical and physical parts of the biosphere. And those will have a large impact on the biotic factors. So it can include things like the pH of the soil, or the amount of water in it, or the type of bedrock, all of that kind of stuff. Biotic and abiotic components will interact with one another, which determines the function of that part of the biosphere. When we're studying the biosphere, usually scientists begin at the most specific level. So they kind of zoom in, usually onto just a single organism, and then we'll move out from there, looking at the interactions of that organism with other individuals of its species, and then how do all of those individuals of that species interact with other species, and then how do all of those species interact with their environment. So you start really small and slowly build out to more and more complex interactions. So the way we kind of define this moving from very specific to more general is that we start with the organism, then we see how that organism interacts with a population, then how that population reacts with its community, and then how the community reacts or interacts with the ecosystem. The ecosystem is then the functional unit of the biosphere. The ecosystem includes both the biotic and abiotic components of that area. And if we take all the ecosystems in the world and put them together, they would make up the entire biosphere. So that's what we mean by the ecosystem as the functional unit. It's like the building blocks of, or the puzzle pieces of the biosphere. Okay, so let's define some of those terms. So the organism is just an individual life form. So if you're looking at a single bacteria or a single animal or a single plant, those are all the organisms. The population is then a group of individuals of the same species in the same habitat at the same time. So if we're looking at, say, a single white-tailed deer as our organism, the population would be all of the white-tailed deer in that area. The community is then all of the different populations of all the species in that habitat. So if we're looking in just one area where that white-tailed deer population are, the community would include, you know, all of the bunnies and all of the turtles and all of the squirrels and all of the trees. All of the different living things in that habitat are the community. And then the ecosystem is essentially the community and its environment. So all of the physical and chemical factors that make up that habitat. And then, like I said, all of the ecosystems, if you put them together, form the biosphere. Okay, dynamic equilibrium refers to the state of a system where there's constant little changes happening, but the components of that system, or the ecosystem in this case, are able to adjust so that the ecosystem as a whole isn't disturbed. So if an ecosystem is in dynamic equilibrium, that ecosystem can remain stable while making these minor little changes and adjustments. Systems or ecosystems that are better able to adjust or adapt to changes are better at maintaining dynamic equilibrium and are therefore more stable. When it comes to dynamic equilibrium, diversity is super important, and there's two different types of diversity. The first is genetic diversity, which is the amount of genetic variation in a population. So when we're talking genetic diversity, we're only looking at one population or one species at a time. So if we were looking at like a human population, for instance, you would want, you always want higher levels of genetic diversity. So what that would mean is like a variation in eye color and a variation in hair color and a variation in height and a variation in skin color, and anything that could be different among people, you would want to have those differences present in your population. That makes for a healthier population. And so it's the same for plant and animal populations. You want lots of differences, lots of genetic diversity. It makes your population healthier. The other type of diversity is biodiversity, which is the number of different species in a community or in an ecosystem. And you also want that number to be high. You want as many different species as possible existing in your ecosystem. It makes for a healthier ecosystem. So yeah, more diversity just means that your either population or community, depending on if we're talking about genetic diversity or biodiversity. But the more diversity, the more adaptable your ecosystem is, which means that it's more stable, it's less likely to go extinct, and it's better at maintaining dynamic equilibrium, that ability for the ecosystem to make these minor adjustments but stay stable overall. So yeah, the more genetic diversity in a population, the more variety of traits you will see in that population. That means that if the environmental conditions change, it's more likely that at least some of the individuals in your population will have the correct genetic traits to allow them to survive. That allows the new population to adapt instead of the entire population just going extinct. So for instance, if you had like a population of squirrels and some of them had really thick fur and some of them had really thin fur and some of them had stubbier legs and some of them had longer legs and some of them were just, you know, more rotund and some of them were really like, you know, narrow and thin. So you have a lot of genetic diversity. And then all of a sudden there's like an ice age and it's really cold all the time. Well, if your entire population of squirrels had long limbs and not a lot of fat and really thin fur, then that whole population is going extinct. But because we have a really diverse population, some of the individuals, some of those squirrels are going to be thick, short-legged, really nice and fluffy, and they're going to be able to survive the ice age, which means that our population doesn't go extinct. So having that diversity allows for some of the population to survive when there is a major change to the environment. Biodiversity supports dynamic equilibrium in a couple different ways. We're going to be looking at four. The first is the keystone species. So a keystone species is a species that if it goes extinct or it no longer exists in your population, that entire ecosystem is going to collapse. So one example of this is like bumblebees. If bumblebees go extinct, then we're going to have a major ecosystem collapse because most plants rely, or not most plants, but a lot of like flowers and stuff like that rely on bumblebees for pollination and fertilization and stuff like that. And so without the bumblebees, then those plants go extinct. Without those plants, you have the death of many herbivores. Without those herbivores, the carnivores go extinct, that sort of thing. So it's really important to maintain the biodiversity of an ecosystem so that you don't lose the keystone species. A lot of the time, we don't know what the keystone species is in an ecosystem until it's gone, and then that ecosystem starts collapsing. So in order to not lose the keystone species, we have to just not lose any species. So by maintaining the biodiversity, maintaining the number of species in our ecosystem, we decrease the risk of losing the keystone species. So the keystone species, it does disproportionately impact the stability of the ecosystem, has a huge impact on the stability of the ecosystem. The second reason why biodiversity is so important for dynamic equilibrium is something called the insurance effect. So if you have an ecosystem with a lot of biodiversity, it means that you're probably going to have organisms with overlapping niches. So when we're talking about niches, we're talking about essentially the role that an organism plays in its ecosystem. So that includes like its jobs, essentially, in terms of like how nutrients are cycled through that ecosystem or how energy is cycled through an ecosystem, stuff like that. And so those jobs are very important. Those jobs need to be done in that ecosystem. And so if you have organisms that have overlapping niches, which you will have in a really biodiverse ecosystem, that means that you essentially have like two people or two organisms doing the same job in that ecosystem, which is really important if one of those organisms starts to, the environment changes and that one organism starts to like die off or starts to not function as well, you still have another organism picking up the slack, making sure that that job gets done. It's essentially like, if we had in our school no substitute teachers, we have like no one who can, do the same job as the teachers that we already have. Then as soon as one teacher gets sick and can't be there anymore, you would just have like all these classes that are unsupervised and not being taught. But because we do have substitute teachers, we have that backup, that insurance effect, that if I get sick, there's someone else that can come in and take over. So that's what we want in ecosystems. We want that overlapping niches or the overlapping jobs that happens when you have high biodiversity, so that you have a backup plan if one of those individuals or one of those populations can't do the job anymore, the job is still getting done by a different species. Just to kind of finish off talking about that, if you have low biodiversity, it means you don't have very many species in your ecosystem. That means you probably don't have any overlap in the niches. And so as soon as one population starts dying off or not functioning as well, that job isn't getting done. And that means that the entire ecosystem isn't going to function as well. That entire ecosystem is at risk of collapse. It's no longer in dynamic equilibrium. So all the jobs need to keep getting done in order for dynamic equilibrium to be maintained and the ecosystem to remain stable. Okay, the third reason biodiversity is important is something called the averaging effect. Essentially, that's the idea that all species will respond differently to changes in environmental conditions, but the average response will remain neutral. So essentially, if you have a ton of different species in your ecosystem, so high biodiversity, and all of a sudden, you know, the average temperature of your ecosystem has gone up by 2 degrees, and the average precipitation has gone down by 20 millimeters a year. So that's a pretty dramatic, even though it doesn't sound like a lot, it's a pretty dramatic environmental change for an ecosystem to adjust to. But the hope is if you have enough species, some of those species are going to be harmed by that change. They're not going to be able to function well at that new environmental condition. So some of them will start functioning worse. However, if you have enough species, likely some of them are going to start functioning better in that new environmental condition. And so the hope is, if the environmental change isn't too great, that averages out, that the number of species that do worse is kind of equal to the number of species that start doing better. And so if you look at the ecosystem as a whole, the change has been neutral for that ecosystem. The fewer species you have, the more likely it is that those changes aren't going to balance out, just because you'll have a really small sample size. And so it's more likely that the entire ecosystem or most of your ecosystem will be harmed. Not enough of your ecosystem will be able to positively adapt to that change if you don't have enough adaptable populations in your ecosystem. So yeah, having a larger sample size means that it's more likely that you're going to have some species with increased reproduction or increased productivity or increased survival. So it'll average out the entire overall health, overall productivity of your ecosystem. And then the last one is resistance to invasive species. So invasive species are species that come into an ecosystem from somewhere else and they start damaging the ecosystem, they start out-competing or eating the native species, which can decrease biodiversity. So we don't want invasive species. And if you have really high biodiversity in your ecosystem, essentially all of the niches in that ecosystem are full, and it's really hard for an invasive species to come in because it kind of needs like an open niche to land in to get like situated in, and then it can proliferate from there. It would be like if, you know, someone wanted to move into Drayton Valley and there was no apartments and no houses empty or for sale or anything like that. It would be really hard to move into Drayton Valley if there was no homes available. So by keeping all of the niches in the ecosystem filled, it makes it really hard for an invasive species to come into that ecosystem. However, if the biodiversity of an ecosystem starts to drop, some of those niches, or at least parts of those niches that aren't being overlapped, are going to start opening up. And as those niches open up, it opens up essentially an area that an invasive species can come into and take advantage of. It kind of gives it like a foothold into that ecosystem. So by maintaining high biodiversity, essentially you are ensuring that invasive species can't get into your ecosystem, or it makes it a lot harder for them to come in. So that is it for talking about dynamic equilibrium. I know that it's kind of hard to wrap your head around the fact that you're saying the ecosystem is stable, even though it is making all of these little changes. The way that I like to think about it is like if you were trying to balance on one foot, as long as you can stay upright on one foot, you are considered stable. So that's like the ecosystem. If you just like tip over and collapse, that would be like the ecosystem collapsing. or if you have to put both feet down. So as long as you can stay standing on one foot, then you are in a stable position. But you're probably not going to be able to do that without some wiggling and some minor adjustments and shifting of your weight. So those minor adjustments don't mean that you're not stable. So just that's the same as an ecosystem. As long as its populations can make these minor adjustments, and maybe some of the population dies off, but the rest of the population then proliferates, or whatever it is, as long as these minor adjustments are taking place, but the whole ecosystem's not collapsing, then it is stable. So yeah, minor adjustments are fine, just like you wiggling around and shifting your weight when you're on one foot. We're just trying to avoid a collapse of that ecosystem. Okay, that is it for today's lesson.